And welcome, good morning. On behalf of the European Liberal Forum, I would like to welcome you today. This is our webinar on the European Green Deal, one of the webinars in a series called On the Agenda. On the Agenda is this series, which is a follow-up of our other successful series called Liberties in Lockdown webinars. And when we started this series at the beginning of the lockdown, we decided that it's very important for us to discuss liberties in lockdown. While we are all in lockdown physically, it's important for us liberals that our liberties are not. And now we are continuing with this On the Agenda series. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of the European Liberal Forum, on behalf of the European Liberal Forum itself, I would like to welcome you, all of you who are with us today on Zoom or watching us on Facebook Live. The topic of this webinar is, of course, the European Green Deal, and I'm very happy that climate change has become one of the most visible topics in the recent ELF work in our activities, and you can see it very clearly if you look at the on our website and you see the calendar of our activities. But also, I would like to recommend you to go on our website, on the ELF's website, and see the publication part, because in this part you can see quite a few very interesting publications, and I had the pleasure myself to attend two launch events of two books, of two publications, on two launch events in last 2 weeks. Both of these publications were prepared with European Liberal Forum together with Forest, our partner from Sweden. Both are extremely interesting. One is on border carbon adjustment and carbon clubs, and the other one is on the effectiveness of climate litigation. So I really recommend you to read these publications, to download it from our website. And in general, I'm really glad that liberals are contributing to the debate on climate change and on the European Green Deal, as I think it's very important for both. It's important from the side of the European actions, or from the side of the European policies and fight against climate change and its consequences, but also it's very important for us liberals to be there to contribute to this debate. This approach is very important to me, and I think to us, because the liberal approach is a bit different than other, let's say, mainstream approaches, because it's I would say more optimistic, it's more proactive, it's sometimes more productive. Like liberals tend to look at things and also at climate change not only as a threat, but also as a chance. We focus on chances, and this is the same if it comes to the European Green Deal. We liberals, the same like thousands of entrepreneurs, thousands of business people all around Europe, we see that there are very clear business reasons to see the European Green Deal as a growth strategy, and this is our obligation to use this new plan, European Green Deal, as a growth strategy, and it's especially important now in the time of COVID-19, in the time of COVID crisis, when the entire continent, the entire union needs this impulse for the economy, and there is more and more research all around the world showing that the green recovery plans, the sustainable recovery plans, can boost the employment, can boost the income and the growth better than the back to normal stimulus strategies. So this is the way for Europe. And the question is not anymore if we do it, but the question right now is how we do it. And for us liberals, the question is how we do it so that this plan is the most successful possible for us, for the people, and for the businesses of Europe, and also how to do it in the most liberal way possible, so that as many of our liberties as possible are safeguarded and are observed. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting one, and it is a very timely one. And I would like to give the floor to Beatriz Ríos, who will be your moderator today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Miłosz, and welcome again everyone to this webinar today. We're very close to the first anniversary of the European Green Deal. It's actually in December 2019 that the European Commission presented its plan to turn the European Union into a climate neutral organization, a climate neutral 27 member states. And there's a lot that we've seen over the past few months put on the table, but also some of the initiatives were actually pushed back because of the COVID-19 crisis. However, when the European Commission put on the table the plan for the recovery of the social and economic crisis that it was a result of this COVID-19 crisis, we saw that climate neutrality was at the core of it, sustainable economy was at the core of it, but we still need to see how. Today, we've seen different initiatives from energy to food on the common agricultural policy. There is a lot of debates around it as well, but today we're going to focus a little bit on energy. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. We have two amazing panelists, and I very much look forward to the discussion today. Before we get into the meat, probably meat is not the best thing when you're talking about sustainability, right? I would like to give some of the housekeeping rules. So just so you know, this meeting is being recorded. We're also live on Facebook, and if you want to ask questions, and we very much encourage you to do so, you can use the Q&A section in this Zoom webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. He's Ancygier. He's a PhD, Senior Energy and Climate Policy Analyst at Climate Analytics. Please, Andrzej, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's indeed a very timely event on a very relevant topic, because the full decarbonization of the European economy, which is the goal of the European Green New Deal, is going to be the biggest challenge or one of the biggest challenges that we're facing, if not the biggest challenge. It will have very important environmental, economic, and social repercussions. Environmental repercussions are obvious, right? Because the purpose of the Green New Deal is to protect the environment, to save us from the dramatic changes to the climate. Economic and social repercussions are also huge, because we're just shifting trillions from the fossil fuels, from the existing economy towards green and sustainable economies. And that's also a way to free economic growth from the limits set by the fossil fuels. So fossil fuels will run out sooner or later anyway. And if not, we'll just spend even more money to import fossil fuels, because the European Union is increasing its energy dependency. So Green New Deal is a way to keep this money in Europe and to spend them on job creation and facilitating economic growth, among others, as mentioned earlier. So social repercussions are obviously important as well, because the jobs will be lost and jobs will be created somewhere else at the same time. So this is a huge element that will shape the social narrative in the coming decades as well. How the world will look like in 2050 is not clear, obviously, and all the projections famously proved wrong concerning the future. However, we do know that there are three elements which are probably going to happen. So the first of those elements is that electricity generation or energy generation will be coming mostly from renewables. And we could not have said this with such certainty a decade ago. But we know that CCS with fossil fuel doesn't make economic sense. This is why it's not there and probably will not be. Looking at the costs of nuclear energy and comparing this with the cost trends for renewables, this also doesn't make economic sense. So that's what we left is renewables plus whatever is left from nuclear in 2050. So this is one of the probably things that we'll see in 30 years. Another element is that centralized power generation will be replaced by centralized and decentralized, but decentralized that will replace the current fossil fuel plants and nuclear power plants will be mostly renewables and obviously offshore wind farms, onshore wind farms, onshore solar PV farms, but a much bigger role will be played by distributed energy generation, by citizens' energy, which I will go into in a second as well. And the third element will be the divide between electricity, transport, and buildings will largely disappear. This is driven mostly by the electrification of those sectors. By the middle of the century, around 50% of the energy will be consumed in the form of electricity. Now it's less than half of that. So we will electrify most of those sectors. And This is posing significant challenges because we not only have to replace the fossil fuels with renewables, we have to also increase and renewables generation to replace energy demand for other sectors as well. So we need to replace oil by, well, renewables. So this is quite a big challenge because we need to ramp up generation from renewables quite significantly over the coming years. However, this is also posing a significant opportunity because the renewables that we will be left with will be mostly wind and solar, weather dependent. And the other sectors offer us the possibility to balance the grid and use opportunities in the other sectors as well to balance the weather dependency of the other sectors of energy. Now, well, the citizens' energy comes into play. Citizens' energy is the mostly prosumers and energy cooperatives or energy communities, which played quite an important role in development of renewables in the past. Those of you who may remember or may have witnessed or discussed the beginnings of the renewable energy transformation know that it was the communities in Denmark, in Germany, in north of Germany that developed wind turbines, for example. When the big projects, for example, in Germany in the 1980s, the Grovian, the biggest wind turbine back then, was actually developed to show that it doesn't work. It did work in the end, and it was scaled up by the private companies in the end, but it was developed by citizens' energy. Now the citizens' energy can have a big role to play in this energy transformation, and it has to have such a role to play because they can co-create the transformation, to low carbon economy by connecting the dots. For example, when we're talking about balancing electricity grid, we're talking about many opportunities and many different ways to do it. You can shift demand if you have a large opportunities to shift demand by an hour or two, for example, from the morning peak and from the evening peak by a few hours. That already is helping the grid quite a lot. You can use the biogas power plant that may be there as well. You can also share energy and share demand management in different ways. And also in many other ways you can balance the grid. But the way you do it depends a lot from the specific circumstances. Maybe there are just enough electric vehicles to charge and to use the oversupply of electricity to avoid negative electricity prices. This depends from place to place, and only citizens' energy and people on the ground know how to use it best, how to connect the dots in the best way. Another way in which the citizens' energy can co-create the transformation would be providing space, because renewables will be.
We're having a problem with your mic. We're not hearing you properly.
Okay, that's probably the connection.
Good.
Now it's better. Okay, apologies for that. So the other way in which renewable communities can co-create a transformation is by providing the space, because renewables do need quite some space, and that will be on the roof. Many of the roofs are just unused, and this is something that we can use if we have the people on board, the owners, homeowners, for example. And obviously, if you have a wind farm next to a community, without them knowing that it will be built, you got into trouble. Then therefore you need their involvement and agreement that will also increase the ownership in the transformation. And finally, what the communities can provide is to find out ways in which we can influence the behavior. In some cases, the communities may come up with ideas that private companies will never come up with in terms of behavioral changes that can also influence. Another way in which
we lost you again. I think it's just the cable is moving, and then we lost your sound.
Okay. It may also be the internet connection. Apologies for that. Okay, but it's working now again, right? So I just try not to move too much. Okay, and the last element in which the citizens can contribute to the transformation would be by providing some of the funding, by leveraging the funding. And here we have an example from Poland where a program for micro PV plants has been scaled up funding provided by the government has been scaled up to 4 times because people did have some savings and did want to spend it on installing their own PV panels on the roof. There are many different ways in which the role of citizens' energy can be strengthened. For example, making the support for them much easier, and for example, replacing the feed-in tariffs for small installations by upfront grants. So that people don't even have to go to the bank to get a loan, because some cases they can just finance this, because that's now in the meantime are much smaller investment than they were in the past. For a solar panel on the roof, you need 4,000 or 5,000 euro instead of 25,000, which was the case just a decade ago. We can also price carbon, not energy. So if the electricity is consumed from your roof, you shouldn't pay for it. And that's the case, unfortunately, in some countries. So that would also help a lot. Getting rid of unnecessary levies and charges, this can be counterbalanced by charging for carbon in other areas much more. For example, in the framework of the ETS. And the connection for the electricity grid, you can counterbalance this by a fixed connection if there is, if you just connect to the grid, no matter if you have a PV panel on the roof or not. I will stop here, and I'm happy to contribute to the discussion later on.
Thanks a million for that. I took a lot of notes of many points that I would like to throw into the conversation. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce the second panelist of today. She's Walburga Hemetsberger. She is the CEO of SolarPower Europe. Please, Walburga, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation. Happy to be here today and discuss the Green Deal, the way forward to a decarbonized Europe. I would like to share a couple of slides here today, which would also show you a couple of figures, also relating to what we've just heard from Andrzej, because I do think, and just reacting very quickly to what he just said, I do think that decentralization indeed plays a major role in the way forward. And that also citizens will play a major role and will have to own the energy transition in order to have the acceptance we very, very strongly need in order to progress on our goal. But let me share a few thoughts and figures first before we are going to discuss. And I hope it's working with sharing the screen. Okay. Please tell me whether you can see my slides. Okay, perfect. European Green Deal and recovery. I would like to first show you some study results, which I have been taking from a study of very prominent figures of 2 Nobel Prize winners as well, who are working for SSEE, Oxford University, Cambridge University. So really the creme de la creme of economic scientists who came up with a white paper just recently on COVID and how COVID could help us in a green recovery. And what they found out by also talking to experts in the field is that green recovery absolutely makes economic sense. Investment in particular, and there's a lot of dots which have to be explained. All of them are standing for different investment possibilities politicians have for a recovery spending, for recovery facilities. And as you can see, the very right area is pointing to those investments which have the highest climate impact, but which have at the same time also the highest economic growth potential. And I just pointed to the biggest dots at the very upper end, which is clean energy infrastructure investments, that's T, and clean R&D spending, which is Y. And that shows that indeed, the money spent in these areas will have a double positive impact on climate change, very high impact, and also in the long run being a multiplier in our economy, which is generating additional growth, which we absolutely and very urgently need. So it's clear investing green is not lost. On the contrary, we're looking at a multiplier, economic multiplier here, which can really get things started. And by the way, when we talk about clean energy infrastructure investments, that is also about subsidies in renewables, for example. At the same time, so it's not just an economic stimulus, but it's very much also what citizens want. And I'm referring here to a survey of a big bank, the ING Bank, who themselves are big investors, by the way, who found out that 71% of consumers really want to have politicians require companies to achieving climate change targets if they get money in the recovery. 66% of the people which they asked wanted to have a clear shift to a low carbon future. And 70% wanted to have politicians supporting renewable sector, electric vehicles, and low carbon emitting industries. So as a start, it does make economic sense to go green, and it's also something citizens want, and we really want to have citizens, buying into decarbonizing our economy. Now, let me just show you a couple of figures when it comes to the solar, the sector I'm representing, and maybe I should tell you also a little bit more whom I'm representing. That's what I was missing in the beginning. So SolarPower Europe is the European Association of the solar sector. We represent the whole value chain of solar in Europe with more than 250 members by now, all working in the solar field, from manufacturing to deploying and everything which is in between. So when it comes to solar, we've just recently launched, and I've heard a lot of offshore wind and onshore wind being cited here today, but I would like to really show you where we're going in solar. We've just recently launched a 100% renewable energy system study together with a Finnish university, La Parenta University, where we looked at the costs going forward. And this study showed that becoming 100% renewable is the most cost-efficient way to become carbon neutral by 2050. So that is solar, and that is wind in particular. There's some other renewable forms as well, but when you look really purely at costs, it is really solar and wind going forward. We are already today, by the way, the energy source with the lowest costs. I don't have a slide here on that today, but we are by far outcompeting already today for any other fossil fuels. So what we found out is that by 2050, we could save as much as 6% in the costs if we would go 100% renewable. And by the way, I mean, that is a scenario which, 5 years ago, no one was modeling 100% renewables. Can you imagine? And variable renewables, where are we going to end with? Much too expensive. But by now, I just read yesterday that there's more than 180 studies looking into these scenarios, because it has become not niche anymore, but it's becoming the most likely scenario. And when it comes to solar, what we found is that looking forward, solar is set to be the dominant source of electricity generation. I know that wind is a lot debated at this point in time because we have the offshore strategy, and I think that's super important. So we absolutely need a lot of wind in our system. But solar very silently is becoming the biggest source in the meanwhile. Just because it's very close to citizens, but also it's very easy to deploy it, and it's very quick to deploy it. So you don't have the acceptance problems you very often have with wind. And really, I'm saying we absolutely need a lot of wind, but just to show you where we're going when it comes to solar. 100% renewable energy system is primarily a solar story. So I don't want to go into too much more details, but that's what you see here on the slide. So we are looking at, in our leadership scenario, we had 3 scenarios modeled at even 63% of our energy system. So not just electricity, of our energy system powered by solar. And, you could say, like, I mean, obviously she's she's the one representing solar companies. So that's what she has to say. And okay, they paid the La Parenta University to get us these very nice figures. But here's one guy who has been very, very conservative when it comes to solar. That's the Director General of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol. And he just recently said that solar will become the #1 electricity source, and not just in 30 years time, but already in 5 years time, after 2022, when we are pursuing the decarbonization path. So that is someone who has been speaking out for fossils for a very long time, but who is acknowledging today as well that times are changing and that solar will become a major player on the energy market. So that was about solar, but I would like to now go into more detail where we see the biggest potential for the green recovery. And as I said, for long time growth, and I'm trying to be short because I know I should only use 7 minutes. But I think it is important to flag where we see the biggest potential to invest in. So first of all, I mean, as you've seen, solar has very, very low costs, and it makes sense to invest in solar. Also looking into the acceptance with citizens, it just makes sense. So we need to boost utility scale solar as one thing, and storage at the same time. So we need additional tenders. We need corporates to buy in, and I'm happy to go into more detail if time allows afterwards on the potential that industry and the commercial sector can play, private industry in deploying renewables. We need to de-risk financing, and very important, because I mean, we have this huge potential, but where we see the greatest bottlenecks today, it's not costs, because it's super cost competitive, but it's permitting. So we need to find a way to get these projects quicker on the ground than it has been done before. On-site solar, another example. So that's all the roofs we have in Europe. 90% of the roofs are unused in Europe. That's a huge potential. So that's over 700 terawatt hours. That's as much as Poland and Germany would need to cover their energy needs. That can be used, unused space, and we need to have a rollout. We have to have a big renovation wave, which is factoring in that potential. We need to promote electrification, because we need to invest in the right infrastructure. In order to support it, we need to invest in smart grid projects, getting, supporting community projects, for example, supporting flexibility, battery storage. Then also one very important point is that we need to make sure that the products we need to deploy renewables are produced in Europe. So we are very much advocating for a solar manufacturing wave, basically, an industrial strategy which is also supporting manufacturing in Europe. We are still global leaders when it comes to some parts of the value chain in solar. So that is also something that most people don't know. So on the raw material side, we are global leader. We have companies in Europe, polysilicon, that is. We have global leaders when it comes to inverters, another very important product we need for solar panels. But cells and modules are produced in China. So we need to get that back to Europe, because we are looking into huge deployment and we want to have the value chains in Europe. Coal sites, former coal sites, that's a huge potential as well, because you need also to know that when it comes to jobs, solar is the technology providing most jobs in the renewable sector, local jobs, highly skilled jobs, and we see a huge potential for reskilling people in those areas where we see declining jobs, to reskill them into jobs we see in the solar sector. 2/3 of the jobs today in the renewable sector are in the solar sector. Like I said, local jobs, which are very, very important. And then last but not least, finance and on trainings and reskillings, as I already said, which is very much linking to transforming the former coal and industrial sites. And by that, I would like to thank you. That was my input, and I'm very much looking forward to the further discussions.
Thanks a lot. I found very interesting that the both of you actually mentioned a couple of ideas. One was the importance of the involvement of citizens, which I think it's very much in line with with a liberal approach to this. Another one was the need for the private sector to get involved as well and to be part of the solution, which is something, again, that it's part of what we're seeing, and the need for investment and research and innovation, which are key elements if we actually want to transform the European economy into a more sustainable economy, and the absolutely key role of renewable energy. We cannot have a transition, we cannot become climate neutral without replacing fossil fuels with another sort of energy. That a lot of things that I took note of and I would like to ask you, but I'm going to start because it was a specific question addressed to you, Walburga, in the chat that was very much in line with the presentation. So let's get first to that, and then we move into a more general discussion with the both of you. So there was a question by Will Wirtz. He said, I am a bit confused by this presentation. The EGD impact assessment released by the European Commission in September said that GDP will decline and energy costs for consumers will rise 20%. Do you think that the European Commission is wrong?
I do think that, I mean, you know, there's different scenarios, but I don't say that the European Commission is wrong. But I mean, on the other side, you have major global economists telling us that this is the right way to go and this is how we can grow GDP. So I do think that there's a huge potential here, and we're not looking at, you know, declining GDP if we get it right. But that is something we absolutely would have to discuss.
I think Andrzej wanted to take the floor as well.
Yes, indeed. I just looked at the impact assessment of the Commission as well, and what I can find, at least, is the range of economic impact, of GDP impact, of decrease by 0.3%, increase by 0.5%. But indeed, this is really dependent on how you can use the resources. And from macroeconomic perspective, if the money that we spend now on fossil fuel imports from countries that not necessarily share the liberal values that we represent here in Europe, if we keep this money in Europe, and I can hardly imagine this will not result in economic growth and in job creation. Another impact is also what kind of growth do we want? Because, well, even the impacts, what you can see, the modeling from the impacts of the climate change, there may not be such a big negative impact from climate change, but, you know, this will be an unequal reality world in which we will live if climate change does happen. So the issue is also about the distribution of this growth. When we're talking about renewables, we're talking about you know, prosumers, energy communities, millions of people benefiting a little bit from the growth instead of few benefiting a lot. So that's also about the quality of growth that we have to talk about.
Now that you have both mentioned these, and I think there are different elements here. When Walburga was talking about the need to have the production of all the means in Europe, I was thinking about this question of the strategic autonomy that has a lot to do as well with the kind of relationship that we have with other countries, energy dependence that the European Union has. We're extremely dependent, particularly some countries. How do you see the role of renewable energy in trying to achieve this strategic autonomy of the European Union in the energy sector, considering the strong dependence that we have right now? And where do you see the need for investment in this production, in this the industrial strategy, in trying to reshape the industry in Europe to make sure that we actually have the means to make that transformation? Maybe Walburga, you want to start? Okay,
but I mean, obviously, if we're transitioning from importing a lot of fossil fuels, as Andrzej just said, I mean, already on the production side, on the energy production side, we are getting more and more autonomous. We're producing wind, we're producing solar in Europe. On the industrial side, we still have to do a little bit in order to also make sure that you know, our further pathway towards a renewable system is also sustained by getting the products we need in order to deploy wind and solar in Europe. So both, it's an issue for both, I would say. You know, whereas there's still some industrial base for wind in Europe, but also for solar in some parts. There's different issues in these two industries, but when it comes to solar, as I already said, it is important to bring back these parts which are predominantly produced outside of Europe to Europe, But I'm very hopeful on that. Because we just recently launched the Solar Manufacturing Accelerator, and that was back in July. I mean, we've been advocating for a solar industrial strategy for a very long time. Maybe I should take it a little bit, give you the broader picture. And when we, started to discuss it with the European Commission, with other stakeholders 2 years back, people told us, come on, it's not really something, where we could champion again in Europe, because we've been the cradle of solar in Europe, countries like Germany, like France, we know the whole technology started. But then all of a sudden that stopped. We had some downsides, and the production went to China mainly. So people said, like, we've been burned, so let's just don't start it again. But now that people see how much demand is created in Europe, and that's the complete game changer today. There's a lot of demand, contrary to some years ago when everything moved to China, where demand was in China. So there's again a huge demand in Europe, and we see a lot of interest again from manufacturers to settle in Europe. So we presented in our Solar Manufacturing Accelerator 10 projects, the 10 most ready projects in order to get on the ground as of next year, basically, and to scale up, because that's the important thing. We need to be very quick. We need to scale up production in Europe. We need to scale up production in new European technologies, in really cutting edge innovative technologies, because it's not the mass market project. And we need to scale it up very quickly, a small window of opportunity, and that is now, in order to get back manufacturing to Europe, and to also be the first ones in new innovative technologies made in Europe. And I think that that is a really huge opportunity we have today, and we should just grab it.
It is a huge opportunity indeed, and as you were saying, we definitely need to scale up if we want to cope with that demand that Andrzej was talking about before. If we are going to replace many of the sectors that are now receiving energy for any other source, we definitely need to have the alternative, and for that we have to go way beyond what we are right now in Europe. Can you elaborate on that as well, Andrzej? How do you see this need to bring back the autonomy of the European Union and to become maybe a producer instead of having to buy the energy, we produce the energy in Europe, but based on sustainable energy?
Oh yes, indeed, and actually we've done this before, right? I mean, the Vestas, a company in one of the biggest companies in the wind energy sector, if not the biggest at this time, it is changing. It's the second or the first place. That was created, it was in 1970s, manufacturer of agricultural machines. And it was exactly the combination and the cooperation between citizens' energy and the private sector, and also government's consistency in supporting renewables, that resulted in this growth of this industry. And also, for solar energy, we just wasted a huge opportunity in 2012, 2013, in the early 2010s, because we kind of, in some countries, Germany, Spain, just instead of changing the support mechanism steadily, to just completely cut support. In Spain, introduced taxes on self-consumed electricity, which was kind of a perfect way how to destroy the industry. And how to do it. So we know how not to do it. And now maybe we should focus on trying to figure out how to do it. Also, we have the opportunity that, in the past, we were talking, the risk in the past was the windfall profits, because the level of feed-in tariffs was reducing much slower than the decrease in the cost of renewables. Therefore, there was a kind of a little bit of panic in Spain, for example, when the cost of supporting PV were just very high, because the feed-in tariffs were unexplainably high as well. Not comparable with the decrease in the cost of renewables. Now we're talking about cost of renewables which are comparable than to the fossil fuels, and therefore that there's just very small chance of windfall profits. So even if you do experiments, if you still need to experiment, but you should actually know, based as a public, as a policymaker, you should know what not to do. You do not risk so much what you do, but you do have an opportunity to recreate and create again, as Walburga mentions. There are great examples of the industry returning to Europe. But for that, we do need domestic market, right? You do not create a market without having the PV panels on German, on Spanish, on Polish roofs, for example. And this is where we should also move forward. But there are also other areas in which we should move ahead. And this is also dealing with storage, with solutions, with ideas. How can we combine this high level of flexible, of weather-dependent renewables? How do we integrate and create a 100% RES-based system? And there's also another part of the question that that was asked regarding the costs for the consumers. That, if I may, the opportunity of the costs of energy for consumers increasing by 20%. Yes, if you charge a higher price of carbon, for example, on the fossil fuels, obviously the price will increase, but the money will return in a different way. For example, in Switzerland, they have this annual part of the money is invested into energy efficiency measures. The other part of the money is returned to the citizens per capita on the same level. So once a year, it's around 100 franc that they're getting annually. That was quite a while ago, at least. So the money does return back, right? But the point is, you have to charge something that you want to reduce. And one of the main ways to increase efficiency is to indeed increase charging for fossil-based energy sources. And again, I mentioned in my presentation reducing the charges on electricity, or getting rid of charges on electricity, which may result in increasing demand for electricity as well. But I cannot imagine that if electricity is cheap, people would just keep on light the whole night because it's cheap, right? But at the same time, this will drive electrification of transport, because you will remove from more expensive fossil fuels to cheaper electricity. And it will obviously make lives of civil society or citizens, energy and prosumers much, much easier.
You both mentioned, and now you touch upon that as well, that it's not only about the energy sector, it's about different sectors that are transitioning into a more sustainable way of working. And I was thinking, because you both mentioned the question of where do we put the solar panels, how did you see this interaction between the renovation wave that the European Commission was pushing forward with the energy transition, and this trying to put those things together and make sure that it's part of the same strategy? Maybe, Walburga, you want to jump in?
Okay. I mean, integrating sectors will be key in the energy transition going forward, and electrifying as much as possible will also be key. The European Commission is looking at a scenario where by 2050, 65% of our energy, our total energy consumption will be electrified. We do think it's even higher. But already 65%, when you know that today the electricity part in energy is 25%, that's huge. And that means that we have to electrify transport as the most efficient means. We have to electrify also the heating systems to a large extent. And the renovation wave in that sense will play a major role. As I already told you, I mean, when it comes to renovating our buildings, I mean, energy efficiency obviously is a very important subject. But when you know that, as I said initially, that 90% of our roofs are unused, we do think this has to be a major part of the renovation wave, because it makes also buildings much more energy efficient to have renewables. And we're very happy that the Commission is already looking into minimum requirements for buildings when it comes to renewables, because it just makes sense. And getting back to also what has been discussed before, when you talk about the price for consumers, what we see is that if you have solar panels on your roof, you're saving as of the first moment on your electricity bill. And in the long run, you're getting back your investment, depending a little bit where you're living, but in between 3 and 7 years. And these solar panels, they're lasting for 25, 30 years. So it's a no-brainer, basically. It just makes sense for consumers. But renovation wave, very important. One thing maybe I would like to mention as well, because it's not known to many people, is that what we're looking at, and where we also see a huge potential, also when it comes to aesthetics, is building integrated photovoltaic. Because it's not just the roof, which you can use on a building, which already has a huge potential, but also the facades, the windows, name it. You have more than 250 products, construction materials, which are already including solar panels. and where you can generate electricity with the whole building, which is, for example, very interesting in cities where the roof space maybe is protected because of historic buildings, or where you only have facades to be able to use. So there's a huge potential there as well. Going forward, where the costs still have to come down a little, but where we see a huge potential as well.
Thanks, Alan. Maybe, Andrzej, you would like to react to this?
Yes, indeed. I mean, the renovation wave is a very important element because we just cannot, we don't even have space on the roofs for the amount of energy we need to heat old, inefficient homes. And from personal experience, I mean, you just cannot replace coal by renewables if the home is not insulated, because the heat pump and that would be powered by renewables wouldn't just generate so much power, and the power, the amount of energy, like the heat pump, the heat that heat pump generates would be maximum 40 degrees Celsius. You know, usually, again, coming from Poland myself, the heaters are just much hotter, and therefore you just need to, insulation is essential to move to renewables in the heating sectors. And at this time, you also have the chance to touch the substance of the building, which people don't do very often. And then, as Walburga mentions, installed exactly the PV panels. So insulation plus PV panels plus heat pump plus tank for water storage if you need it as well. This is kind of essential elements of the transformation that will also improve life quality, that will also improve the reduce energy poverty. But for this, we do need resources from the government as well. But we also need a very simple way to apply for this funding, because just sometimes people are just so, it seems like so complicated to apply for the funding that, you know, if they have to fill out very long formulas that they don't really know how to do it because they've never done it before, I will never do it again. Why should they even try? Or people just are not willing to try. But again, a best lesson, again, from the coal land, mainly from Poland, the subsidy for the micro PV, which I had the chance to have a experience with myself. And, you know, application for the grant took us something like 10 minutes. And that was really an example of how to do things in a country in which there are so many examples of how not to do things.
There was a very positive note coming from Poland indeed, and it's true that the question of reducing the administrative burden is key to make sure that citizens take part of these. I wanted to go back again to the role of citizens, because it's not only in Spain. We have a question that how can you promote solar panels deployment through citizens if there is no incentives? For instance, in Italy, they passed to pay 0.74 kilowatt to 0.15 in a decade. So this is an issue that it's not, curiously, is in Spain and Italy, where we have a lot of potential for solar panels, and yet we see this kind of legislation. So I was wondering, from a European perspective, what can the European Union do to make sure that countries promote incentives to make sure that citizens can be part of the solution as well? Because as Walburga was mentioning before, they definitely want to be part of the solution.
Shall I go first again? Okay. But thanks for that question. I mean, indeed, incentives are very important. And I think there's a huge opportunity we have now to use recovery funds in order to provide these incentives, because it makes sense. Then if you ask me what the European Commission can do, I mean, obviously the recovery funds will be used by member states. But I think that, and they will decide on where to spend the money. But I do think that the Commission or the European Union as in general has a role in guiding member states and giving them ideas on best practices, gathering best practices, and having incentives for installing renewables in general. I think just makes sense. Now, when it comes to the question on Italy. I mean, one thing which we also have to see that is obviously that the costs in a decade have also come down considerably of our technology. So in the past 10 years, we've been looking into cost reductions of 75%. So that's huge. And that's why it's to some extent understandable that then also governments decide to reduce the incentives. I mean, I would have to look into the exact figures on Italy, so I can't tell you anything very concrete here, but it's just normal that that also the incentives are following a little bit the cost curves, which are coming down, and they're coming down, and they keep on coming down. So for every terawatt hour installed, we see 20% of cost reductions in the way forward as well. But indeed, I mean, member states need to invest the money wisely they have now for the recovery. And it's a no-brainer, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, that it should go into renewables and there should be incentives to roll it out.
Thanks a lot. Maybe Andrzej, very quickly.
Yes, and in addition to the subsidies for small solar panel on the roof, what I find even more interesting and important is the bureaucratic. I mentioned this already, but for example, in Germany, after 20 years, you have to pay part of the renewable energy support fee, kind of as a. So in the past, we had the solar tax in Spain. I mean, the money that the state collects in this way is minuscule. And people, well, you can, as a government, imagine, this 0.1 cent that you would have to pay as an owner of a PV panel on the roof to contribute to the cost of energy generation. This is very small, so why should people not be discouraged by that? I mean, the very fact that you do have a commitment that you have to pay a value-added tax, for example, or any other kind of additional payment, people are afraid of that because they're not quite sure if there will be no invoice coming up from the tax office or from any kind of administration, and they will just not be able to deal with it. And for many people, still climate change is not the priority. We have to get them on board. And for those people, it's something that they should be doing in between working 40, 50 hours a week and getting of the kids and doing some other stuff. This is, the space, this maybe 1 or 2 hours a week. This is something that they have to deal with PV panel on the roof. And we should allow them to make it doable within this very small amount of time that they have to deal with this issue.
Because we're coming to, yes,
just let me comment on that. It has to become much easier. There's some countries where you have to fill like 10 forms in order to be able to install a PV panel. Lithuania, for example, is leading the way here. They put everything together in just one form, and they made it as easy as possible for consumers to install a PV panel. So that is, for example, a best practice which should be promoted.
Definitely simplifying the system and having incentives, it's absolutely key. Because we're coming to the end and there is a question that we haven't addressed, but I'm going to try to put all these together because there's so many things that I would like to ask. But first of all, I would like you to make a short reflection on what should be the role of the private sector in all this. And second, because of all the data that Walburga, you shared with us, citizens want this. It makes economic sense. Why do we still have so much resistance from the private sector and from some politicians to make this happen? And what do you think we should do to convince those people? So please, the last remark first, Walburga.
If I can, no, I'm unmuted. I mean, vested interests. I mean, there's huge sectors which want to just continue as they wanted to do it. Also, you have these figures in front of you, and that it makes sense. But getting back to your first part of the question, what is the role of the private sector? I think the private sector can play a major role, and they're already doing it, because when it comes to companies there's more and more pledges of companies who want to become 100% renewable. I mean, you're flooded with these pledges on Twitter and LinkedIn, fortunately. So there's a lot of companies going forward on that. And there's a huge potential as well. Like, for example, when it comes to power purchase agreements that these companies are making, or even on-site installations of solar, we've seen 55 gigawatt in 2018, and there's potential to increase that to 140 gigawatt by 2030. So there's many companies who are willing to invest and become 100% renewable in their energy consumption. It needs a better framework because there's still some barriers for these companies, but there's a willingness, and companies, whether it's small companies or the big companies who are leading the way currently, have to be encouraged, and it has to be also made as easy as possible for them to source 100% renewable energy, not just electricity, but energy in general.
Thanks, Emilio. Maybe Andrzej?
Yes, I mean, private sector. I was surprised by the development in Poland. It's not very often that I can say so many good things about the renewables in Poland. So I would take advantage of that. So we had this program introduced in exactly a year ago, where you get this €1,200 for installing a PV panel on the roof. And I was afraid that it was enough for 200,000 installations, roughly. And I was afraid that there would just be no capacity to, people's capacity or like companies to do it. And again, I got involved in this myself. And within a few months, you had a new industry created, and numerous small, medium-sized companies specializing in putting panels on your roof and doing all the paperwork for you. That was amazing what private sector managed to do in this regard. But what I'm afraid of now is that this will collapse, because this program used up all the money. It's not quite sure how it will continue, if it will continue. So private sector needs this security that this funding, this will come up. And this is why we need targets. This is what we need goals for. I mean, for Poland, that was an attempt to meet its 2020 goals. In 2018, the government realized, or 2017, 2020 just around the corner, and we have the binding renewable energy goal that we have to meet. So let's do something about it. Now there is no binding goal for renewables, or a goal that would you have to pay for not meeting. And this is something that I see as a major risk for some member states, where the policymakers are not very willing to support this source of energy, which takes me exactly to your other questions, Beatriz, about the role of the public authorities or the policymakers. I mean, in some cases, maybe they know how to do it, but they just get so stuck in this existing framework, Renewable Energy Act or Renewable Energy Law in Germany, for example, which was an amazing tool to accelerate development of renewables in the early 2000s, right? It was 7 pages long. With each amendment, it got more and more complicated. You now really have to be an expert or get an expert and pay for the expert to understand what's there. What are the hidden elements, or maybe not so hidden, but that you may not fully understand. So in some cases, they've just been building upon existing framework, and it gets just too complicated. Science for itself. And again, the success story behind the support mechanism that we have in Poland for micro PV was that it was kind of built from scratch. So it's kind of like additional element, additional funding scheme, without too much history behind, which again worked perfectly. So this is exactly vested interest. I agree with you, Walburga, but in some cases, it's even beyond that many policymakers just don't know how to do it. And they're just building on something that's been there before, instead of maybe starting from scratch.
Maybe we have an opportunity to start from scratch, or at least to reform all this legislation in the context of the EU Green Deal, and to make sure that we have more funding, we have less administrative burden, and that we definitely have targets. We will have a discussion in December about the 2030 target, which is very important, considering if we want to absolutely achieve the 2050 climate neutrality, but we will have to wait and see what happens. Poland is a major player there. Maybe I hope that you have a lot of good things to say that day as well about Poland jumping in as well, Andrzej. Thank you very much to both of you, Walburga and Andrzej, for your amazing contributions. It was really, really, really interesting talking to you today. And thank you for everyone who joined today. I'm going to give back the floor to Lauren Mason for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and thank you to our panelists. I think it's very clear that the COVID recovery will have to be a green one, also because this transition creates new jobs and skilled jobs for people. We heard how important it is for citizens to own the energy transition, whether that's by giving a piece of their roofs or through their purchasing power, and we also heard about the role that incentives can play in that. Walburga presented for us the advantages of solar energy, and that's very important. I think it's also important to mention that as Liberals, we do act in favour of kind of a technology neutral approach, which means that, as Andrzej mentioned, we charge for the emissions, we have a polluter pays system, and companies that are involved in the details of these technologies will innovate around that system. And I think, Andrzej, it comes back to what you mentioned as well, that sometimes this legislation is getting very complicated for policymakers to understand. So let's put the expertise in the hands of the companies. We also talked briefly about the potential increase in strategic autonomy that comes with producing more of our energy within Europe. But I want to end on an optimistic note to say that I think we can be happy about all of these new technologies that are being developed, and we should all have the courage to try those out and see how we can use that to assist the transition. Well, thank you very much to Beatriz, to Andrzej, Walburga, and also to Miłosz, who joined us today. I'm very happy to say that we will be here again at the same time, same place on Thursday, the 10th of December, which will be our final on the agenda webinar for this year. And there we'll be looking at the rule of law, especially in the current context of what's going on in the European Council. So until then, thanks again for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.